Welcome to Building Your Best Brain podcast. I'm so excited to be back. This is the first podcast of 2025. And what makes this podcast even more special is this is the first time I have a guest on the show. So if this is your first time tuning in, you're in for a treat. If you're a returning listener, still in for a treat. Today I am interviewing Nina. And Nina, we actually have a bit of a history together. We both have a background in neuroscience and we're both from Ottawa. But what makes Nina so unique and special is that she specializes in workplace stress as well as workplace management to prevent burnout, both at the employee level as well as the manager level. Based off of what you guys have shared with me, I know that a lot of stress can come from the workplace or that we bring our own stress into the workplace and vice versa. So in this episode, we have lots of interesting studies that Nina has shared, but also really practical tools that both you and your employer can implement in the workplace so that not only you're thriving in your workplace, but you're also thriving in your day-to-day life. Nina is actually doing her PhD in workplace management, and so she drops in a little bit about her research there. And if you're curious to learn directly from her, in the caption and the description of the podcast, I have a couple great resources she recommends, ways to get in touch with her, as well as a TED Talk that she gave that is also incredibly valuable. And this also came at a really great time for me because I have fulfilled my goal already of 2025 of hosting my very first live masterclass. So this is a virtual live masterclass. It's going to be an hour and a half called Stress Detox, Managing Your Stress with Science. So it's equal parts going into the neurobiology of stress in a way that I've never explained it before, looking at how different stressors impact this response, as well as how the stresses are presented, how it impacts your response at both the brain and the body. And my favorite part, which makes this masterclass really unique, is to develop a personalized stress toolkit. So this is something that both my research, personal life, and that I've tested out with many students has significantly helped me improve my baseline stress levels, as well as how I handle stress in situations where stress is inevitable. So this is happening January 26th, noon Eastern Standard Time, and you will get a live recording if you join, but this is live in the sense that I'm not going to be selling this separately. And the reason is because I want interactive elements, which means I want the group to be smaller and have access to me in a really uninhibited, safe, potentially vulnerable way. So selling it after the fact doesn't really fall in line with that. All those details are also in the caption, along with a promo code, because it's the first time I'm offering it. So I want to make sure that if you want to get in, there's no barriers, and we can flesh out some great tools for you there. And without further ado, we're going to dive into this juicy episode with Nina, all about your brain, the workplace, and how to prevent burnout in a way that you've probably never thought about before. Welcome to Building Your Best Brain podcast. I am excited to have our first guest ever, our brilliant friend, burnout expert extraordinaire, Nina. So welcome, Nina.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. I didn't know I was your first guest. What an honor.
Well, you you reached out. I don't know if you remember. It feels like forever. I started this podcast almost a year ago, maybe. And after the first episode, you said, if you ever wanted a guest, reach out. And you've been in the back of my brain, and it's been one of those things where, like, why haven't I done this sooner? It's such a great idea. So thank you. Thank you for being here and taking the time. I was also thinking, so for those of you who don't know, I am born and raised in Ottawa, and I'm in Montreal for school. Nina, are you in Ottawa right now?
I am in Ottawa right now. So I also attend school in Montreal. I'm doing my PhD at Concordia University, but I was able to move back to Ottawa for the dissertation phase because we can do so much remotely these days.
Okay, definitely have to ask about your PhD. I was curious about because I've been following you, but of course you can only follow so much. And I'm like,
Yeah.
I need the dots here. But we've crossed paths in Ottawa a few times, and I was trying to figure out, trying to like bring my long-term memory back. I believe it was for bronze med or NLS maybe for swimming, lifeguard stuff.
Yes, it was, but I can't remember if that's where we first met or if we had already met before that and then showed up and already knew each other for bronze med, but we definitely did lifeguard training together.
So I think we did. I had the same feeling, but I was like, but I don't think that was the first time. I think the very first time might have been through figure skating. No?
Ooh, I don't figure skate, but I did do a lot of sports, so we might have crossed paths somewhere athletic.
Which sport? What was your sport?
At that time, I would have been in triathlon, so I was swimming, biking, and running.
It might have just been the swimming then. Might have
Maybe.
just been the swimming. But it could have been more than once. I mean, you remember, right? Like how many of those you take and like your first aid trainings, and it's a whole thing. Were you ever in camps? Maybe it was in camps.
Yeah, through the city of Ottawa.
Oh, maybe. I did a couple
We
of them.
went to
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
camp.
Mystery solved. Um, Before we dive into all of our topics today, I would love for us to start with kind of a pretty neutral icebreaker, just like a random, completely unrelated question about the brain, burnout, workplace, because we'll have lots of time to get into that. So, my question is, if you had to pick one meal that had to be healthy to eat for the rest of your life that you're not allowed to get sick of, what would that meal be?
Ooh, I think it's gonna be a smoothie, like a
Let's
really hefty smoothie, like a meal tier smoothie. Like we're talking banana, greens, mango, oat milk, like all the stuff in it because there's enough flavors and it's hearty. It's got everything. Yeah, I love a good
That's
smoothie.
a good one. I haven't heard that one yet. You don't think you would miss like biting into something? Like you think like a smoothie could definitely.
Oh, I was thinking this was the only healthy meal I get, but I could still eat chips at other times.
So you would have smoothie with a side of chips, and that would be what keeps you
Why
going.
not?
I love it. I feel like
Basically, girl dinner.
yes. It's so funny you said that. I'm a big meal prepper. Like I'm one of those people that like Sundays I block off hours to like make a bunch of food. And I've been noticing that's been inducing a lot of unnecessary stress for whatever reason. And so I've been doing girl dinner where it's kind of like I'm gonna look at my fridge and assemble random healthy things that feel good to eat, but if anybody saw them would be like, "What are you doing?" And I love it.
I love a good smoothie plus bag of popcorn for dinner.
Okay. Noted for my next girl dinner. Smoothie and popcorn. I love it. So, Nina, I think maybe a good place to start would be to share how you've gotten to this part of your journey. So, what I'd like you to share with us is a little bit of your education background, but you're doing something very interesting with your PhD. And so maybe walking us through the education, but also maybe the life experience that have led you to this point in your career in education.
Yeah, I'll share a little bit of both because it really is the two coming together. So I have my bachelor's in neuroscience and mental health from Carleton in Ottawa. And then I went and did my master's in management, also here in Ottawa, where I studied how leadership impacts the way that employees experience stress at work. I studied burnout, I studied stress perceptions at work, and then went on to do my PhD also in management. And I'm a couple years in now, so I'm actually just currently in the process of writing up my proposal for my dissertation. And I'm looking at how factors like predictability and variation in workloads impact people's experience of stress in their jobs. So my education has taken this really unique combination of neuroscience and management. But I love to tell people when they're like, oh, you switched fields. Like, no, because people use their brains at work. So it's actually all very connected. And especially with the way that I study it, a neuroscience and mental health bachelor's, as you know, is a really heavy emphasis on stress and what's going on in our bodies and our physiology from that perspective of neuroscience and what our reactions are to stress. And then in management, we also have a really keen interest in stress and employee well-being, just coming at it from more the perspective of what's the relevance for the employee experience, for the workday, for managing an organization. So when you put these two perspectives together, you've got the physiological, psychological side of things, and then the more managerial day to day. And it's a really powerful combination to then be able to help people work in ways that are more brain friendly and a lot healthier for them. So that's the education. And then I also had my own experience with burnout. I didn't know that's what it was at the time because I hadn't heard the term burnout back then, but in 2017, I massively overextended myself. I was taking a course overload in my bachelor's. I was working a very busy job. I was at Apple retail, so you're on your feet all day, 20 hours a week. And
Genius.
my father was going through, what's that?
It was the Genius Bar. You're one of the geniuses at the Genius.
Uh, I was a workshop facilitator.
Ah, very cool.
Yeah, so the pieces are all going to come together. So I
Amazing.
think at the time that I had my burnout, I wasn't in the workshop facilitator role yet. I was newer to the team, but that did end up being my job that I did there for a while. Yeah, so I also had my dad was in remission for leukemia, so I had this big family thing going on, and I burnt out. I burnt out so badly that I collapsed in a yoga class and hit my head on the floor. It was a huge wake-up call for me to start making my well-being a priority, not an afterthought. And so this was really a perfect place to be for that to happen was in a bachelor's of neuroscience and mental health because I started looking at the research and the science and saying, okay, I know this and I know better. So how am I going to start using what we know about stress and mental health for myself? Fast forward a couple of years, went into my master's degree. Now I'm studying burnout there. And the pandemic hit. All of a sudden, everybody was talking about burnout and mental health more than ever before and saying, what do we do about this? I was asked to volunteer for a organization that helps women re-enter the workforce after domestic violence or challenges in their lives. And I had given some volunteer workshops. So my love of workshop facilitation that I had from working at Apple in that role, coming together, my educational background. So I was giving these volunteer workshops and I was hearing all these conversations about burnout and people were like, what do we do? And I was like, I can actually help with that.
Yeah.
So I started doing job stress and burnout prevention workshops for organizations. So fast forward a few years, I'm currently in my PhD working on my dissertation proposal at the moment. And I have a business where I do stress management and burnout prevention training for companies.
That is wonderful, Nina. I do have to say, one, and this is like really not important, we have the same bachelor's. I don't know why that didn't pop into my mind, but yes, we went to, we went to college. You gotta love how the brain like reshuffles. It like brought the lifeguarding to the front and then the education all the way to the back.
Well, we
Um,
weren't in the same year though. We never had any courses together.
no, we didn't. That's true. That's true. That would have helped me remember, that's for sure. The pandemic for many reasons is super interesting. Mental health definitely came to the forefront of the pandemic, and certainly the term burnout became way more popular. And I experienced burnout in my master's, and it's interesting when you have a neuroscience background and then you experience these really extreme forms of stress, and it does show that there is a disconnect. I don't want to blame the education system, but in the sense that yes, we can understand the neurobiology of stress and still not know how to manage it in a way that we can actually live our lives in a manageable way. I think you're
So
bridging
true.
such good things with tools, which we'll dive into, but also the fact that the majority of us work and work takes up a
Yeah.
huge part of our lives. So if we have a severe source of stress from work, it's not something that we can really ignore, which your extreme example, which you're not alone in, right, showed that this is not something that can be brushed to the side. Your body is clearly responding. And I'm so glad that not that that experience happened to you, of course, but that experience has led you here, doing what you're doing now, helping many people in your role as a workshop facilitator. That is freaking awesome.
Thank you.
You're
And
welcome.
you're so right about the translation piece. That's really what I see as my role now, is to take the science and the research and the information, which has so many of the answers that we need, and
Yeah.
make it into strategies that we can actually use.
Yeah. No, completely. It's amazing. It uses a different part of the brain. It uses a different set of skills to be able to understand the cellular molecular piece of it and then bring it into like, okay, but why do I even care? Like right
Yeah.
now. I think a great place to start would be you talked about it a bit, but your definition of burnout. And you can take the neuroscience lens, you can take the workplace lens, psychology lens, whatever lens. What would your definition of burnout be?
I use the World Health Organization definition, which is burnout is an occupational phenomenon resulting from chronic job related stress that hasn't been successfully managed. And I like this definition because it helps us keep the focus on the workplace. So while there are other pieces of our lives that are, of course, going to overlap because work does not exist in a vacuum, it helps keep that responsibility on organizations and the environment that we're in and the way that we're approaching work. And it also points to how burnout is about chronic stress. It's
Mm.
something that occurs over time. So having a little bit of stress in our day to day is not a bad thing and can even be a good thing and keep us motivated if we're managing it in healthy ways. But if it's chronic and unmanaged, that's when we veer into burnout.
And what would you consider a stress that is unmanaged? Like, let's say you're an employee, you're trying to figure out, right, like what is stress that I am managing well as it arises versus stress that like I'm not managing well. How would I know the difference?
Some of the stressors that we encounter at work are good and important and necessary, and those ones are going to feel motivating and enticing, things that we want to engage in, like projects that give us a chance to learn and grow, taking on new responsibilities. Those are the kind of stressors that we want to be managing in the first place. And then we have the stressors that really just hurt us and get in our way. This is bureaucracy, bullying at work, things that don't help us get our job done. And ultimately, we don't want to manage those. We want to eliminate them. For people who are in managerial roles, their responsibility is to get roadblocks out of the way of their employees and
Mm.
protect them from things that are going to stop them from being able to do their job. So if something is a stressor that's really harming us and really getting in our way, we want to look at, okay, how are we going to remove that? But then when we look at the stressors that are a natural, healthy part of our job, managing them means that we get adequate recovery from those stressors. So one
Mm.
of the really cool things in the research is on our experiences at work is work engagement, feeling really invigorated and excited about your work, really connected to your work is related to burnout over time if people don't get adequate recovery. So even the things that we really love about our jobs and are excited about demand our attention. They are a form of strain, they use our energy. So managing that stress is going to mean adequate recovery, disconnecting from work, making times for the things we enjoy outside of work, getting regular breaks so that then we have the energy and we're able to come back into work the next day and be excited to be there.
I love that you brought up recovery. I think interestingly too, you can be doing things that engage you at work, but that still takes energy out of your tank. Something that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong because you have your eyeballs all over this. Millennials and then Gen Z, right? There is potentially more of an attachment of work is a part of our identity and that it's important to us to have work that's fulfilling. So there is kind of more of a sensitivity to that than, let's say, like our parents and our grandparents. So I'd be interested to know how that might be playing a role in the research, but it does also tie into the fact of even if you are doing a job that you love, that you can burn out from that too. It's not just the jobs that, you hate or the tasks that you hate.
Yeah, absolutely. I really believe that it is possible to love your work and find fulfillment and enjoyment in your work. And I feel that everybody deserves to have that from their work. There are a lot of psychological benefits to engaging in work that we enjoy. And at the same time, physiologically, work is still a demand.
Yep.
So, in order to continue enjoying the psychological benefits of work that we enjoy and that we feel connected to, we have to have the opportunities to recover so that we're not becoming physiologically depleted and burned out.
One thing that I find interesting about what you're sharing, a little background on me. I did my bachelor's and master's right after, and then I worked in biotech industry for like under 3 years, and then I did my PhD. So I do have some experiences in different types of workplaces, and work culture is a very cool phenomenon. I would love it if you can share what makes up a work culture and who, and maybe there's probably not a right answer for this, but who is responsible for maintaining a work culture and kind of like setting a precedent? Because I'm sure, and you can elaborate on this, that there are some work cultures that promote burnout at a higher rate than other work cultures.
Work culture is formed by everyone who's in the organization. The people make the place.
Mm.
One of the kind of gaps that we have in management literature is understanding how work cultures form, because rarely to never do we have the foresight to have, the one person who has a startup in their garage and then hires another person and then hires a person after that. Like, we don't go and study those people. There's no company there, there's nothing to study. So it's
True.
very rare that we actually get to document culture forming in the early stages to see how it emerges. But one thing that we do know is once cultures are shaped, it's very difficult to change them. And they are the product of all of the people who are in the organization, either bringing in pieces of themselves to work or forming into the norms that are already there. So, in a way, there's a responsibility for culture with everyone who's in an organization. And there's a really cool paper published recently. I can look up the citation for it for show notes, that was saying with things like employee well-being, the biggest factor in determining if a culture is going to change and take on a stronger orientation towards well-being is employee buy-in in the initiatives. So managers and HR leaders can, put all of this stuff forward, but we also have to get the team on board to make those shifts. So in terms of who's responsible, I'm going to say we need leaders at the front saying, here's what we're going to put our focus on. And leaders have a huge influence on employees' experiences across the board for everything from attitudes to compensation to stress and everything in between. So we need leaders who are they're driving it in some ways, but it's also about the employees participating. You can have the most well-intentioned leader in the world who, is trying to create a culture that's going to be supportive of well-being, but if the employees are absolutely adamant that they're not along for the ride, the culture is not going to change.
That is amazing and not the answer I was expecting. Oh my gosh. We're so quick to kind of blame our managers and bosses, right? And we're kind of, or maybe I'm being super biased and showing my colors on my work experience, which I loved. I loved working in biotech. It was a startup and it was fast paced. And so I definitely saw the propensity for burnout, like working more than 8 hours. Definitely like my phone would ring on the weekends and it was work related. And that was just normal startup life, trying to file an IND for the FDA. And as employees, right? I mean, it's kind of a part of the startup life. Fortunately or unfortunately, it's fast paced, so you get a lot of experience quickly, which is great, but we don't want to be having concussions in yoga class either, right? So we often would hint that it was in part management that set unrealistic timelines. But at the same time, we also as employees followed it and made it every time.
And there's that, right? Like there's participation. And I think that's where it's often with anything to do with the workplace, it's both. It's
Yeah.
you as an individual, what you bring to work, and it's the organization. And the kind of answer to everything is how it comes together, your interaction with your work environment. So it can be really difficult to pin down, oh, it's this policy, this manager brought this in, because, like you said, then it's okay, but if the team is always needing that, if you have, for example, a lot of industries, especially those that require a bachelor's degree to get into in the first place, have a culture of perfectionism that comes forth from the education system. If you think about, well, we were both in neuroscience. We studied on the floor with engineers at 2 a.m. We saw that culture building in architecture and medicine. This perfectionism is so ingrained. So if you then take a whole lineup of 10 new grads from, let's say, an engineering department, and you plunk them into a brand new firm with, a couple people at the executive level who are saying, we're going to have this incredible work-life balance, flexible work policy, you can do whatever you want, but they're now you've got this, new wave of employees coming from perfectionism culture of the undergraduate level. That's immediately going to be a challenge. And that's what I see a lot in teams that I work with, is leaders and managers who are like, we are trying so hard, and we told them a million times, take your PTO. And then I've got the employees over here being like, but if I take my PTO this day, then this is going to happen, and this will happen in the project, and then this is going to be the blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, oh my goodness, we need to all talk to each other, because we have just different sides here, and people are not connecting, but there's a lot of good intentions.
Course. And I think that ties into a couple of things. One thing that's coming to mind is kind of burnout from the workplace, but is it the work culture? Is it self-inflicted because of intrinsic motivations? People that come from university, especially from different fields, right? Like academia definitely breeds a certain type of person, and certain types of people are also attracted to that. I know for me, once I started getting into the workplace, once I started getting into the job and I was a bit comfortable, I immediately was like, what's next? Next promotion, next challenge, next skill, like kind of, always wanting to move forward, which isn't a bad thing, but it can get pathological, of course, right? Because it's stress related. If you don't have good boundaries within yourself, Burnout City is not that far away. So the question that I would like to ask is, let's say you're speaking to an employee that, has this intrinsic motivation that is leading them to burnout, regardless of what work environment they're in. What would you tell them, or what tools and strategies would you suggest for them?
For that, I like to start with some of the personality profiles that are really strongly associated with burnout. Type
Ooh.
A, perfectionism, and people pleasing. If someone has an intrinsic drive, yeah, that's pushing them towards burnout, there's a very good chance that they identify with one or all of those personalities. I love when I'm in workshop and talking about this, and people in the chat are like, I know you said to pick one, but can I pick all three? I'm like, yeah, you can absolutely identify as all three. I'm only going to let you work on one for now, or it'll be too much. But
Right.
that's a really great place to start. And so I like that you mentioned, it's regardless of the work environment. And this is where it can be teased apart a little bit. So I really love an equation from psychology called Lewin's equation, which says that person times environment equals behavior. And I've seen the same thing in my work. Person times environment equals mental health at work, mental well-being, burnout or not. It's you and how you're interacting with your work environment. So
Mm.
one of the things that I like to tell the people that I am working with is, if you are using every stress management strategy under the sun, and you're setting really good boundaries, and you're doing the things to support your well-being, and you're still burning out, you're probably running into an environmental issue.
Mm.
If you seem to be burning out in every environment that you go to, no matter how much flexibility and autonomy and PTO they give you, that's a you problem.
Cool.
That's probably going to be personal responsibility. So if you're sensing that it is, usually it's both. Usually it's a combination. It's not one or the other. Usually it's both. So for the personal side of it, I recommend starting with type A perfectionism, people pleasing. And what that's going to look like is tapping into the places where you're doing extra work that does not contribute to your goals, because that's the thing that all of those personalities have in common. It's driven by different reasons, but all of those personalities are doing extra work that doesn't contribute to their goals. For the type A person, they're doing it to impress other people, to look impressive, to be competitive. They're doing extra work for the sense of accomplishment because there's this huge competitive drive. I am very type A. I have absolutely made major life decisions based on what sounded cool.
Mm.
That that's how I chose my first bachelor's. I actually started in cognitive science and I transferred to neuroscience. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. I got into nutrition, cognitive science, business, all kinds of things. I picked cognitive science because it sounded really cool and quirky and I thought it would be impressive to other people. And then I switched into neuroscience later and it kind of worked out that neuroscience had the same effect, but that was a driving factor. With perfectionism, it's the need to be or appear perfect, again, to others or to ourselves. We have this
Mhm.
really high, impossible standard to reach that ends with us doing extra work, spending extra time on things that aren't actually contributing to the goals. And with people pleasing, it's wanting to be non confrontational, to be or appear really helpful and kind to other people. So, a great exercise as a starting point for any of these personalities is to write down your goals, write down what your specific goals are, what you're supposed to be working on, and then get another sheet of paper and write down everything that you're doing. Just brain dump, write down all the tasks that you're working on, all the stuff that you've been assigned or assigned to yourself, because
Yeah.
we all have been there when we make up work. And then take a look at that piece of paper. Look at your goals, look at the brain dump, go through it with a highlighter and say, okay, what are actual tasks I need to do? And what did I make up or assign myself or add on and stop doing some of those things?
That's such a good exercise, Nina. I'm laughing and smiling because, like, of course, I'm so there. Like, I've so been there, and I say been there like it's in the past, but like any good kind of perfectionist type A people pleaser, it's one of those things you constantly manage, right? Because you can kind of slip into it and not realize. And then you're
Yeah,
like, oh, well, I'm like really tired, or oh, I'm feeling kind of irritable, or like not as patient as I usually am. So
yeah.
that is an awesome exercise.
Even when you've got the stress management portion of it down, like I pretty much do at this point, my most persistent type A quality is that I make up rules for myself. I
Wait,
make up rules all the time. I had a TikTok go viral last winter, 2 million views,
I
and
love
it landed me a couple of huge clients, including BMO, CDIC, some really fantastic organizations. And it was a trending audio that I had used to make this reel. So even though the joke really landed with people, everybody in the comment section was like building on the joke and it was so funny. It didn't occur to me that I could keep it going. So I hired a business coach recently who was like, well, why don't you just make another version of this post? Like, keep the joke rolling, do more with it. Have you posted it again? And I was like, well, no, I can't do that. I use the trending audio and you can only use the trending audio once. Therefore, that's over. I was like, that's a really dumb rule.
It's I so get it though, and I wonder if it's like a way for our brains to protect ourselves in a way, or it's just interesting what our brain will grab onto that seems logical, and until you bring it up to the front, it's like, well, yeah, of course, like there is no other way.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
When companies hire you, well, I guess one thing I'm kind of interested, there's a few things I'm interested in, but one is, what kind? You mentioned some, right? BMO. Companies hire you. How big are the teams? Are they public, private, non-for-profit? What they're asking of you most, right? When they say, "Hey, we found you through your viral TikTok or your website or your Instagram. We love what you do. Can you come to us and give us blank or help us with?" blank?
I'm doing training for them. So it's typically very similar, and then we customize pieces based on that organization and that team. So my primary offering for organizations is a workshop series called Beat Burnout. It's 4 workshops, and we go through personal well being, job related strategies, boundaries at work, and then managerial skills and supporting others with burnout. So, pretty much every organization that I work with some exceptions, is going to go through that program, and then we'll customize different pieces of the program to suit the needs of the team. So, for example, a team that is in consulting or at the government, their workday for the work related factors workshop is going to look quite different than first responders. So we'll customize the pieces based on what's going to help them have a workday that is more brain friendly and helpful to them. And in terms of what industries, as you're probably hearing already, it's a huge range. So I focus my online content primarily towards STEM and knowledge work based organizations. So I work with a lot of tech companies, a lot of human resources, engineering teams, but I also get to work with dentists, first responders, um, theater production companies, and everything in between. It's one of the really fun parts of my job. Typically, what they're coming to me for is, well, it's training. The reasons that they're coming to me though are uh, typically either they've gotten some data back from their team, some employee survey has gone out, something's come back where they've said, oh, we need to deal with this, or it's already kind of a part of their culture that they're working on, and they're excited to bring in an outside person to further emphasize their commitment to well-being.
And so the trainings that you provide, is it typically just to management or is it the entire team or like select members of the team?
It's usually to the team, it's usually to the whole team. So the organizations that I work with have ranged from organizations that have 11 employees total to organizations that are operating in 90 countries. So there's a really big range. Typically, I work with groups of about, or at most, 50 at a time. So that'll be one team together. I love having employees and managers in workshop together because, as we were talking about earlier, it's really a powerful way to get people connecting. When you have employees and managers there together, it helps people have conversations about what's happening in the work environment, what obstacles might need to be addressed or changed about the way that people work. And it helps signal to the employees that managers are not only putting this on employees, but are excited about it and they are willing to participate themselves.
Participate themselves and probably shows how human they are too. When it comes to being like super stressed and under all these deadlines, that it's very easy to demonize people, unfortunately. So I'm sure having them all in one group, ingesting the same information, asking questions is a very great unifying experience for all of them.
Yeah, I haven't had anyone use the term demonized before, but I definitely get messages to that effect that are like, I'm so happy my manager was here because I actually thought that everything was their fault. And I've been really mad at that. And it's a really consistent piece of positive feedback that myself and the HR team, when they're collecting data afterwards, or even just in messages that I get, that's a very big piece of common positive feedback is I really loved that my manager was there. It also helps to build up shared language and shared knowledge of the strategies. So now people are on the same page and can have better conversations.
And can be more accountable, right? Because they have a way to communicate about something that is pretty difficult. And I imagine in your trainings, there's a lot of vulnerability that comes up because there is, as you've talked about, right? Burnout as kind of a potential environmental factor, but then there's also the intrinsic factor, right? What people are motivated by, what's important to them. And bringing that up in the
Yeah.
work, I can't imagine is something easy to just bring up to your boss on one-on-one.
No, it's not. I use a lot of anonymous poll and interactive activities in the workshops towards the early parts of them to help people see that they're really not alone in these experiences. So then we can open the doors to actually having the conversations.
What are some of those some of those polls? Like, what are the things that you're asking anonymously at first to get a sense of where everyone's at?
Yeah, things like if people have experienced the dimensions of burnout. So we talked about the overarching definition from the World Health Organization. In workshop, we go deeper into the dimensions of burnout, like emotional exhaustion, cynicism, loss in your sense of professional accomplishment. So we get deeper into the signs. So I'll ask people if these seem familiar and if these are resonating with them. And you'll see coming back in the polls, yes, they are. It's not just one person who's been feeling this way. Also, things like the type A perfectionism, people pleasing tendencies. By that point in workshop, we're often pretty comfortable throwing them in the chat. But if I have a team where people aren't really responding at first, what I'll do is type the terms into the chat. I'll type the word perfectionism, type A, so then people can like them without having to write it down for themselves. And the likes will start coming in. At first, they're kind of slow, and then they pick up and they build as people realize, oh, it's really not just me.
Yeah. Yeah. Something you brought up too, which I didn't think about, because often with burnout, and it makes sense, we think about ourselves, how we manage our own stress and the tools that we use to manage our own stress. But I mean, we're not like living alone in this life. And at work, right? We're certainly not alone at work. I'm curious about fourth pillar of your training, which is managers and how they support people who have experienced burnout or like on the verge of experiencing burnout. What are a few tools that you give them or you've seen have worked really well in the past?
So that workshop is really cool because it combines everything that we've covered in the first three workshops on well-being, work-related strategies, and boundaries. And then I introduce another tool that I call a burnout support multiple choice card. And so the idea there is to use what we've learned in the other three workshops and create a structure to support others. So in a burnout multiple choice card, you brainstorm 3 to 4 ways that you can support others that are within your capacity to offer. And now you have something written down, 4 points, that is a multiple choice for that person who might be struggling that you can go to them with, or that you can send out very proactively. So I had an organization once, for example, where we did a full day training. We did 3 workshops in one day, 2 with the team, and then with the leaders, we did that final workshop. That was before it became a full team workshop because I kept getting all the employees being like, no, no, we want to be there too. So now everybody goes. But at the time, it was just the leaders going. And one
Awesome.
of the things that happened during the workshop on work related factors was the employees were talking about workload and they're social workers. So assigning cases in social work based on the number of cases is a starting point, but often you don't know until you get in and start working with a client how much time and attention is going to be required for a case and what's going to go into it. So what would happen was
Mm.
maybe each person would get 3 cases assigned to them, but for one person, those 3 cases require like a total of 2 hours of their attention a day. And for another person, they got, 1 case alone that is taking like 18 hours of their week because it's so high demand. So they're thinking about this numerically. Now, the employees brought this up, and there was a director who said, well, just come back to me and tell me when that happened, because we got some people who don't have enough work to do, and we've got others who've got too much. The best we can do is assign cases based on the number of cases. But if that's not how it's playing out, just come tell us and we'll redistribute the workload. And the whole team was like, we can do that? They're like, this is going to be so great. So when we went into the burnout multiple choice workshop later, she said, I can offer to redistribute the caseload. And I said, you need to be sending this burnout multiple choice card out every quarter. This
Mm.
needs to go out as an email that you type up to the team where you say, hey, here's the ways that I can help you if you feel like you're at capacity. 1, 2, 3, 4. Here's what it's going to look like. And this means that employees know what to expect. They know that they're asking for something that they can actually have, that their manager is offering to them. And it allows the manager to protect their own capacity and well being. Don't offer to hang out with someone for 3 hours. If you don't have the capacity for that, offer to have a 15-minute coffee and then direct them to an EAP program. So it's a really powerful tool because we're defining what help looks like. It makes it easier for employees or peers to say yes. And it means that you, as the person offering, get to define what you have the capacity to give.
Because I imagine that's different for different people. It's hard to manage people. I have some experience in different ways, but I've never managed a team at a corporate level, dealing with employees that have corporate level stress. I mean, lots of different jobs have different stress. I don't mean to like harp on corporate. To expect everybody to provide support in the exact same way is just as unfair as asking to employees to show up and work in the exact same way. So I think that's super brilliant that you help them come up with strategies that they can support their team that's individual and feels true to them.
Yeah, it's been a really effective strategy to implement, and it makes use of all of the other strategies that we come up with across workshop. And then it's just protective of both the person offering the support and really takes off some of the burden from the person receiving support, where they're going to feel like they have to figure out what they need, or they have to be the ones to ask or come up with specifics, which is really hard to do when you're burnt out. Like when you're burnt out and someone's like, well, let me know if you need anything. You're like, I will not, but thank you so much because
Yeah,
I am tired.
tired, depleted, your metabolism's out of whack, you're likely sick because your immune system's compromised. Like you're really like so far away from homeostasis. It's like I find that so interesting because often when we're experiencing burnout, or we could even maybe bin it, and this is maybe controversial, maybe not bin it with other mental health conditions, we often look to those people to pull themselves up and get the help and resources they need, but they are at their most vulnerable and poorly resourced, right? So it really is more of a team effort. So I love that you really bring that as a part of your training. That's awesome.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned there that expectation being placed on the individual. I'm a big believer that, again, it's a bit of both. We need to do things for ourselves, but we also need help and support of others, especially in a team environment. And one of the really vicious parts of burnout is one of the physiological changes that happens is you become more reactive to stress in burnout. So when you need less stress in your life, everything just got more stressful and a lot harder. So, for you to be expected to figure out what you need all the time, especially at work, that's a lot. And it's just so much easier if someone says to you, hey, I can see that you're really struggling right now. Here are 3 things that I could do for you. Pick one, and I'm going to help you with that.
Literally so good. It's interesting, right? Because we definitely become reactive when we're burnt out, and it's just like adding fuel to the fire. Like you're just burning up the little bit of gas you have left. So I love that example. That's so real. There are a few questions I'd like to ask, and I think I'd like to take it a little bit away from the training and the work you do and kind of focus more on your day to day, because you mentioned, right, that you're doing your PhD at Concordia. So whenever you're in Montreal, we'll make coffee happen. It's going to happen. Um,
Okay.
and so for your PhD, are you at your candidacy, or you're starting to write up your thesis?
I am a PhD candidate, so I am done my comprehensive exams now, and we have a structure where we do a very extensive proposal for the dissertation. So that's what I'm working on at the moment. So we get a lot of the groundwork done from the theoretical and writing perspective before we start the data collection, which is hopefully going to be early next year.
Ah, cool. Okay. Yeah. Every program is different. So for our candidacy exam, yeah, we do more of a thesis proposal with like a little bit of data, but not a ton. And so we do that early, and then we do our research. And of course, by the end of our research, it looks very different than our proposal, which is fun. It's a part of science. But okay, that's interesting. So I'll pose you two questions. One, I'd love to know a little bit about what you're doing in your research, if you'd like to share, and if you can share. I know some, supervisors are very hush hush. And then how you're finding balancing being a PhD student and then also having this thriving like workshop facilitation, like burnout business happening. So those are my two questions.
My research, I'm really excited about. I love talking about it, so happy to do so. I study appraisals. So I study how people appraise the stressors that they encounter at work as either challenges that they can overcome, that they can rise to, that are going to be psychologically beneficial to them at work, like we touched on earlier, versus hindrances, things that are going to get in their way, be threatening to their well-being, kind of interrupt their workflow. So this is a model that we have in the research to help us understand the way that employees experience stress at work. Do they see the demand they're encountering as a challenge, something they can deal with, or as a hindrance, something that's getting in their way? So what I study is what factors impact that perspective. What changes whether you see the demands you face at work as a challenge or a hindrance? In my master's thesis, I looked at leadership and found that transformational leaders that are very inspirational, very attuned to their employees through cultivating psychological empowerment within their employees, they help employees view stressors at work more as challenges and less as hindrances, less as threats. In my PhD, I'm continuing that work looking at other factors, basically. So I'm looking into, in particular, variability and predictability. So with variability, we're talking about how much the demands of your job fluctuate. And with predictability, we're talking about whether or not you know that those changes in demands are coming. So that's what I'm looking into right now, is understanding how those factors are going to change people's perceptions of the demands they face in their jobs.
Do you have any predictions about those variables? Do you think one will be more potent than the other? Or do you expect any other factors that may be more individual will play a part in those variables you're measuring?
Yeah. So the other piece that I'm going to be looking at is, and this ties into our earlier conversation about recovery, the other piece I'm going to be looking at is people's psychological detachment from work. So one of the theories around predictability is that knowing what's coming will help us with stress, right? Because we know how to prepare for it, we can get ready to cope. But knowing what's coming and worrying about it and stressing out about it constantly is very different than knowing what's coming and taking advantage of that to rest and detach and recover from work. So that's an individual factor that I'm bringing into it. And I think we're also going to look at bringing leadership in as well as another factor that might influence how helpful it is to have predictability at work. With the kind of initial factors there, the variability and predictability, I'm looking at the interaction between the two. So kind of high level, the theory is that the more variation you have in your job, looking at workload specifically, the more variable your workload is, the more you're going to view that as a hindrance. Like that's going to get in your way. My theory behind this is that if the workload is fairly consistent in terms of the volume of demand you're facing, that will allow you to focus more on the content of your work and embrace the challenge of the work itself. But if you kind of never know if you're going to have, 2 hours of work to do today or 12 hours of work to do today, you're going to become a lot more focused on managing that variability than on actually looking into the content. And then with predictability, the theory is that the more predictable your workload is, the more you'll be able to view it as a challenge because, again, now you know what's coming, you can develop coping mechanisms, you can get ready for it. And then, kind of at the worst, is when you have a very variable and very unpredictable workload. It's changing constantly, and you never know when it's going to change. That's when it's going to be the worst. theoretically.
That makes a ton of sense. Complete aside, but when I did my honors project, we were looking at a mouse model of depression, and the best way to generate the model at that time, which is like almost 10 years ago now, was to